Excuse me.
Bless you, Carolyn.
Thank you. Okay, we already have a very good group. So nice to see. So I am just going to go ahead and get started since we're 2 past the hour. And I would like to welcome our presenters for this week at the Workshop in Cultural Affairs series here at the Center for Cultural Affairs. Our 2 presenters today are Amanda Ashley from Boise State University, and then Dr. Carolyn Lowe from Wayne State University, who is Amanda's co-author. And they're talking today about a project they've worked on called Placemaking in Practice, Municipal Arts and Cultural Plans Approaches to Placemaking and Creative Placemaking. So I'm just gonna turn it over to Amanda and Carolyn. So happy to have you with us today. And I will monitor the chat and the questions that come up. So if you're in the audience, please just feel free to put your questions in the chat or in audio. We generally try to reserve questions for the latter half of the workshop. However, if there's something pressing, don't worry about waiting, just put it in the chat and we'll see if we can address it. So thanks, and go ahead.
Good morning. Hi, it's so nice to see you all. My name is Amanda Ashley, and Carolyn, you want to do a wave?
Yep. Hi, I'm Carolyn Lowe.
It's the beauty of Zoom. I just wanted to take a moment to thank Doug, Michael, and Joanna and Julia. This center has meant so much to me in terms of being very isolated out like in Boise State and being able to be around researchers in a way that I had always felt really isolated. And so I'm just so grateful for the work that you are doing to bring us all together on top of all of the other things that the center has done. So I just wanted to express that particular gratitude. It's also lovely to see people's names and faces on here that I have looked up to in terms of research for a very, very long time. And so I'm really grateful that they're there, and also for like the up and coming and the emerging researchers and students and practitioners that are out there. And this kind of community work feels very important. And I had been missing that for a really long time. So thank you. So I will also just say, for those that didn't already hear me say it, I have a little bit of a raspy voice. I am just coming out of COVID. And so again, so grateful for Zoom. Otherwise I wouldn't be able to do that. So I'm going to get our screen sharing here and see if I can get that up and going. Can everybody everyone says they can see that. We'll get up into view, slideshow, and then we'll see how that works. Is that looking good for everybody? All right, fantastic. So we'll see.
Amanda, we see, or at least I see the slides sort of at the bottom, not the full screen.
See if this works.
Yep, there you go.
Is that better? All right.
Thanks.
I only had slight panic on the inside when you said that, Carolyn, so we're in good shape. So again, you know, as Joanna mentioned, the title of our talk is Placemaking in Practice. And we'll, in this talk today, we're going to talk a little bit, I think, more holistically than just our specific research per se. So talking a little bit about the interdisciplinary team that we had when this project started and our growing team that we have today. Karen Bubb is also on I believe on the call as well, and she's one of the authors of this paper as well. She is a PhD candidate at Boise State and also is the arts and cultural planner for the city of Boise. And so she helps us bring some unique perspective, and we'll get into that in a second. You can kind of see the other stuff that we're going to talk about here in terms of like, why are we even doing this research? Like why we're interested in it, the kinds of questions we have. And believe me, when we started to do this work, our questions were probably for just this one project we're talking about today, 40 of them that we've tried to condense into like a much smaller set, talking about like our methodology, what we found. And, you know, I think we'd also love to hear from you what you think about what's happening out in the world and like who we as researchers that are studying this, like, you know, where we should move in that direction. So this whole team started in pre-COVID. If there ever was a time, sometimes I can't remember that time. And I know that I personally, you know, I have a lot of stuff that I've done independently by myself, but the work I like to do the most is in collaboration with others. In part because I love to learn from other perspectives, disciplines, trainings, and so on. And in the questions I'm interested in studying, that's the, having that kind of deeper perspective, I think answers the questions better for what we're trying to do. And so I had reached out to Carolyn Carolyn Lowe, who's, the guest speaker with me today, because Carolyn has like really deep training in general planning and also in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so much of her work is like on not only on plan formation, but plan implementation and plan evaluation. And so, and my background is in economic and community development. And so very different than that. And so thinking through how she and I could do a project together where we could kind of merge our different expertise to answer these questions. And so we brought along a variety of other people on the project too, the authors that you see on this, the paper that we're talking about today. And we brought together both our backgrounds, but also people from theater, visual arts, public policy, and so on to take a look at this topic. I also just want to note that in addition to the academic side of thing, we also brought in people that were practitioners. So Karen, first and foremost, is a practitioner. She's going on that journey for a PhD, but we wanted to bring in that expertise. We also had a land use planner on the project as well, because we wanted to make sure that we were doing meaningful work. The other thing I will say, and in part it's because, and maybe other people have different experiences, but there's not a lot of huge grants for the kind of work that we do. And maybe someday, right? Someday in the near future, or thinking more about integration and so on. But there's other kinds of support that really matter to us. So like Randy Cohen at Americans for the Arts and his support that he has given us in terms of giving us access to his data sets and information has been foundational for us. The other thing I would say is Sunil Iyengar at the National Endowment for the Arts is so easy to access and talk through like what he thinks are like really interesting ideas and whether there's other people that we can connect with. And so I wanna mention those two for a second. So Carolyn and I had this idea of thinking through arts and cultural plans, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But to do this kind of work that we're going to talk about, it needed time, money, and support. And so we were able to get some seed funding from both of our universities to start the work that we're going to be talking about today. And so we were able to start thinking in a more deep interdisciplinary way because of this kind of funding. And we did a retreat in Scottsdale right before COVID, where we were able to like really come together as a group and talk through some of the initial data collection that we had done, and frankly, to change course on a couple of things where we were running into some roadblocks on. It also paid for us to have a GA work on the project as well, which we ended up being a lifesaver, to say the least. Carolyn, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of emphasize how much of a lifeline this team and project has been during a really difficult time. All of us have either young children or family members who had health struggles during this period, and knowing that, if somebody had to kind of step back for a little bit, there were other people who were going to keep pushing the work forward, was just so helpful, and just made the whole kind of hard time that we've all gone through recently so much less lonely. So it was not only an extremely productive time period for us, but also just a very connected time period for us. So I think that's a way that I haven't worked as much in the past. And it's something I really would recommend to other people, because this can be a very lonely job. And it's just been so much fun to work with people who are excited about the work and just really smart and just doing a great job and have people to collaborate with. So I'll just leave it there.
And so the team that we have together, we have a variety of projects that we did based on a data analysis of all the arts and cultural plans that we could find for municipalities in the United States. And we have had quite a bit of success on getting these things published. We've looked at diversity, equity, inclusion, arts and cultural planning. The one that we're going to talk about today is on placemaking and creative placemaking, looking at the role of higher institutions of education or higher education institutions, however my brain forms it at the time, like in the role of arts economic development, and then looking at the connectivity between, or lack of connectivity between, general planners and arts and cultural planners. And so we'll talk about some of that other stuff later in terms of, kind of where our team is going, but we're going to primarily focus on this one paper today. So generally, speaking, you know, when we're focused on, and this team is focused on arts and cultural plan making and implementation, the first phase that we're at right now, that we're about to close out, is trying to figure out like what these arts and cultural plans tell us, just as documents in and of itself. And, you know, sometimes we'll get people that will ask us, well, who cares about the plans? Like, why are the plans important at all? And Carolyn, you want to talk a little bit about why that does matter?
Yeah, I study plans, all different kinds of plans, and have for a long time. And although we know that there are activities that take place outside the plan, we also know that the plan is the sort of official distillation of all of the arguments and discussions and community input, and political calculations that have gone into making that document. So however a community chooses to use that document, it is a consequential act to have adopted it and to have created it. And so we do think that studying the plans themselves is important. Given that we do know that what happens after the plan is also very important, we're going to head in that direction next and look at the context and some of that sort of political backstory around the creation of those plans. But we did think it was important to start with those documents. The other thing is that they're publicly available. So anyone, you know, a community member, a practitioner, a researcher can find these documents and access them and study them. So I think for those reasons, we wanted to start with those plans.
And so now thank you for your patience as we kind of try to set up our team and why we do the stuff that we do. We'll get right into the placemaking paper now. So, you know, we were having a conversation when we were, not Sedona, where was it, Carolyn? It was
Scottsdale.
Scottsdale. I'll get that right one of these times.
Sometimes we should go to Sedona. I hear it's
I have, which is what's sad. But like, you know, I'll blame COVID brain fatigue on that just a little bit. But we were talking about how general planners tend to use the language placemaking, and arts and cultural planners tend to use the phrase creative placemaking. And sometimes, you know, and both of these terms for policy diffusion reasons had seemed to become ubiquitous. People using them a lot, sometimes, you know, from our assumptions or our hypothesis, maybe in interchangeably ways, and maybe they shouldn't be. And we'll talk more about that in a second. We also felt like, you know, it was probably time to look more closely at like a national study, given the fact when the phrase itself, creative placemaking, came into be as a concept and as a practice, I think back in 2010. And the same thing with placemaking. Placemaking had been, as a term, had been around obviously like a little bit longer. The other thing I just want to note is that a lot of these activities were all happening already. They just weren't called placemaking, right? And so it's this notion of how a term comes to be and take on power and to take on some kind of force. Again, we also, as I mentioned, thought there was like a little bit of confusion, you know, like we would be with planners, maybe like, what are you talking about with creative placemaking? That's just placemaking. And then the same thing in the other direction with arts and cultural people that we would talk to. We also, you know, were aware that there are these different parallel or perpendicular streams of conversation and practice and scholarship about the exciting things of placemaking and creative placemaking, but also really deep concerns about them as well. And we wanted to get a sense about whether those conversations were happening in isolation, or if it was possible that these arts and cultural plans were also embedding some of these concerns and strategies around them within the plans themselves. I'm going to move you all over here a little bit on my screen. There we go. And so it's super fun. And a lot of people on this call actually have done work on helping us understand like what is placemaking. And so some of the items, you know, that you hear about in a very kind of generic kind of way are, it's about places where people want to be, where people want to live, where people want to work. It's about trying to create activity in places, about trying to make interesting places, which, you know, I think, how do we make places, right? All of these like really good papers and research and practice, trying to understand how to give people advice about how to make places. And I put make in quote, you know, drawing on some of the work that Andrew Zitzer has done in that way, which I think is really good if anybody hasn't checked that out yet. And so at the same time that that's happening, right, there's this whole body of literature that's talking about placemaking that may not actually be including art and culture in that. Is also some framing literature on what creative placemaking is, right? And so a lot of this comes from the excellent report that Ann Markuson and Ann Gadwa did you know, from 2010. And you can see how they put arts and culture front and center in terms of how we think about creative placemaking. And it's an idea that Eleonora, who I think is on the call, you know, really calls like this multi-level governance response, right? That once this report, you know, in collaboration with the National Endowment for the Arts, in collaboration with the Mayor's Design Institute, and so on, came out with this, all sorts of other kinds of funding opportunities, programmatic opportunities, technical assistance from both the federal government, civic, nonprofit, private, and so on, really kind of took this idea to heart and took this idea in a variety of different directions. At the same time, or maybe a little bit later, there were a lot of concerns about what placemaking and creative placemaking may do. And a lot of that is that there seemed to be some concerns, not just seemed to be, there were concerns that the focus was on economic growth, not about community development, not about a more equitable approach to thinking through what placemaking could be, or whether the word placemaking was even the right word, or the right word, but maybe shouldn't be. And so there were a lot of critiques, and you can see some of the language here that, you know, comes out from opportunistic placemaking, critical placing, making up places as opposed to supporting organic activity, a real deep history of using placemaking to displace people, to exclude people. And this notion of like the struggle for the right for the creative city, like what happens to artists, you know, once they participate in some of this placemaking stuff, and are they pushed out? Are they welcomed? Or, you know, is it a form of art washing, right? And so there's these different kinds of conversations that are happening. And some of the most powerful work for me, you know, and I will note this, is Roberto Bedoya's work on thinking through placemaking from the perspective of place belonging and placekeeping, and thinking about those that had traditionally been excluded or erased or ignored, and how to help them think through that particular process. And so, you know, in response to some of those critiques, I want to make sure that we're giving credit to some of these national funders and other kinds of organizations that have tried to adjust, right? That have tried to like put more of a focus on community-based social equity issues, more about social justice, you know, taking back very top-down, these are the ways in which you evaluate creative placemaking, and trying to do a more organic community-led kind of approach. And so, you know, as academics and as people that do applied research, Carol and I and others were really interested in, okay, well, how are these conversations, how are these concerns, how are they playing out in these topical plans that we are, that we're focusing on? And again, municipal arts and cultural plans tend to be a little bit different than, like, say, regional plans or comprehensive plans or blueprint plans or transportation plans, because of the ways in which arts and cultural infrastructure is so dispersed and differentiated throughout different city agencies. But like, as Carolyn said, we were really focused on wanting to study these plans to figure out what they tell us, because they are important, because they do guide perceptions, they do guide priorities, they do guide investments, and so on. And so these were kind of like our guiding research questions. When I said we had like 70 to begin with, or 40 or whatever it was, these are the ones that we came down with. So is there this disconnect between how academics and scholars talk about placemaking and the way practitioners think about it? And to what extent are these plans looking at placemaking with a critical or evaluative eye? And then how does this policy term, this notion of creative placemaking, how does that change the way that these plans are talking about placemaking? And do they make a distinction between former kind of like placemaking language, literature, and then with the inclusion of the word creative in it? Carolyn, you want to take it over and talk about some methodology stuff?
Sure, I would love to. So for this study, we started with a list from Americans for the Arts of creative placemaking, of arts and cultural plans. And then we did a lot of internet searching to find any plans that weren't on that list. And so we ended up with 64 municipal arts and cultural plans. This was the summer of 2019 that we identified these. So I'm sure there have been more adopted since then, and we probably didn't find all of them, but that was a pretty good roundup of all the ones that were readily available out there at the time. To study these, we used content analysis, which is a very extensive deep dive into the language that's in those plans. And we had a protocol that was, I don't know, 60 or 80 questions long. In planning, we do a lot of content analysis, and there's been kind of an emerging consensus that you really need 2 coders for analyzing any document like this. And in our experience, as much of a pain as that is, it's true, because when you have these very long documents, there's not any kind of standard way that they're organized. It's very difficult for one coder to pick everything up. And so after we had 2 coders go through every plan, we went through and reconciled all of the areas of disagreement on any kind of point. So if somebody said they saw something, they saw a section about public art and somebody else didn't find it, we went back and looked to see where that was. And if that public art was really there, then we would add it. And what we found was not that the 2 coders disagreed necessarily, but it was just really difficult for any one person to pick up everything. So I would say if you're doing this kind of work and you really want to be sure that you've gotten everything, the 2 coder system is really the way to go, as labor intensive as it is.
I think can I add in one thing on there, Carolyn? I think the other thing I would say is the content analysis. When we first did the content analysis, we were focusing entirely on some of our earlier work on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We hadn't yet come up with focusing on creative placemaking or some of our other work. And so we ended up having to go do the content analysis twice for the variety of different projects. And that was like a huge lift. Like, I wish we had figured that out right away, so we could have done the content analysis for all of it at once. And so that's like, you know, I think a little bit about that. The other thing I would say on that is we're also happy to share the number of questions that we asked in that content analysis, if anybody else wanted to see what that looked like.
Yeah, we'd be happy to share that protocol. And we did end up having to go dive back into them, which, you know, if we'd been able to figure out this stuff at the beginning, we wouldn't have had to do that. But I'll tell you, it does make it so that you know the plans very, very well, and can remember them later and say, oh no, which was the plan that had this particular thing in it that you're interested in, and you remember them. So that's one advantage of such an approach. So what did we find? These cities that we looked at are extremely diverse. We looked at cities from New York City with over 8 million people to some tiny towns in North Carolina. The level of diversity in their populations really varies a lot too. The percentage of immigrants in these communities varies a lot. So there's not really anything that we can say about kind of the average community. They are really, really very different. So we have kind of lower income communities, we have high end communities, we have very not diverse communities, we have very diverse communities, and those differences do play out in some of the things that we see in the plans. So what did we find about placemaking? A slight majority of the plans used either one of those terms, either placemaking or creative placemaking. There wasn't a huge difference between how many plans used one versus the other. Plans were more likely to define creative placemaking, we think probably because there's that ready-made definition from the Godwin and what's the other author's name?
Markuson.
Thank you, Markuson and Godwin report. A lot of them just kind of copied and pasted that right into the plan. But a lot of the plans would refer to creative placemaking once and then maybe refer to placemaking after that, as though it was sort of a shorthand. And so consistent with other work on this same topic, we find that that plan authors, practitioners are not necessarily making a big distinction between these two terms. There were 2 plans that really stood out in differentiating between placemaking and creative placemaking, or creative placemaking in another term. the Boise plan, I would encourage anyone to go look at that, because that was really a completely different kind of a plan than any of the other ones we saw. It was very focused on equity, very focused on place keeping. So making places activated, interesting, improving quality of life for the people who already live there, rather than kind of bringing in new people, new activities that would displace the people who are there. That plan is just written with a really different orientation than many of the other plans we saw. And then in Boise, there was I think that, is that first one from the city of Boise? Or
that one's from Oakland. And I think you meant Oakland for the earlier one, not Boise. The people should take a look at the Oakland plan.
Yeah, everyone should take a look at the Oakland plan. But so the Oakland plan is the only plan that uses the term placekeeping, which we found pretty significant. And then also makes a distinction between placemaking and creative placemaking, where creative placemaking has this more equitable community focused aspect. We also were asking, how do plans see placemaking? What are the components of placemaking? How specific are they about what kind of placemaking they're doing? And the answer is not very. So you can see that that none of these potential strategies are mentioned by very many plans. The top ones are neighborhood investments in public art and murals. Then there's another category that, we did go through and look at that and see if there were kind of themes that we could pull out, and there really weren't a lot. And then arts and cultural districts is the fourth one. So this is consistent with other work we've seen in planning, where there's an enthusiasm and a willingness to talk about these kind of buzzword terms, but there's a lack of specificity and follow through about what it would mean to actually implement them. We've seen that in other work we've done on equity and on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I actually just read a paper that by Stacey Harwood that talks about being a welcoming community for immigrants. And it's the same thing, where they say they want to do it, and then they don't really have any specifics that would let them kind of actually implement that. Benefits of placemaking, again, not a lot of specifics here. What we thought was super interesting about this was that the most commonly reported benefit of placemaking and creative placemaking was that it supports diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we've got the academic literature saying, hey, watch out, placemaking can be a force for gentrification and displacement. It can, paper over the actual culture of a place and replace it with something that's kind of more sanitized. But in these plans, we're seeing lots of, relatively many of these plans think of it as a strategy that can support DEI. So we thought that was a really interesting kind of contradiction. And then the other ones that were the most commonly reported were that it beautifies the community, redevelops neighborhoods, and revitalizes areas of the city. And then critiques. There are very few plans that were at all critical of placemaking in the way that the academic literature is. Again, Oakland stands out here for their exploration of some of the concerns around placemaking. The most commonly reported concern was about gentrification, but you can see that only 13% of the plans even mention that. So there's much more enthusiasm and willingness to view placemaking in a positive light in these plans than there is to be critical of placemaking. And that, can be for a couple of different reasons. It could be that plan authors and practitioners are just kind of not aware of the concerns around placemaking that the academic literature discusses. It could be that they really do see benefits for DEI that academics aren't aware of or aren't seeing. So it's, it's possible that there's really something going on there that's positive that academics don't know about.
I think it's that. I think also, just kind of piggybacking on that a little bit, we've noticed like in our other work too, that a lot of these plans are really marketing focused, right? That it's not necessarily in the same way that a general comprehensive plan would be or a transportation plan would be and so on. And so it's trying to serve a lot of different purposes. And so it's possible that, the way that it's structured, it's not intended to be that. But I also think just like as arts and cultural plans start to mature and become more common and become more, part of this kind of like forward thinking where investment and resources go, that's something for us to think about as well. You want me to take this one? So again, go ahead. So we're always trying to find like clever titles for our paper to keep the readers going. So we were talking about like in terms of our discussion is placemaking and creative placemaking, is it a force for change, a force for good, or both, right? And so Carolyn's already talked quite a bit about how these plans often use the terms interchangeably, that they often far more talk about the benefits than the concerns. Simultaneously, like Carolyn said, the ones that do talk about the benefits do put it in relation to DEI, which I think is interesting. But again, there's really not a whole lot of a deep dive into explaining what those terms can mean, how they're connected to different types of strategies, the implementations you would do, or how you would evaluate them. And Carolyn already mentioned, a variety of reasons why that might be. I also think one of the other things that, we talk a lot about is just the critiques of plans themselves, right? The plans tend to, even though they're supposed to be forward looking, they're often a snapshot in time, right? That often arts and cultural plans aren't funded to be produced in the same way that other types of plans for cities are funded, right? And so there's limited resources that go into them. It's also possible that there's lots of activity that is happening around their understanding of placemaking and creative placemaking, but it's just not in the plan. So, we talk a lot about that. We would also argue that it is important for it to be in the plan, right? Because they are meaningful documents, because they are inventories and set the stage for arts and culture. And so that's kind of where we are at with this kind of like initial research that we're doing by just specifically looking at the plans themselves. Right now we're in the process, and I can't remember if I mentioned this earlier, again, apologies for my COVID brain, but we are surveying general planners in each of these cities and arts and cultural planners in these cities to ask them how they use the arts and cultural plans, why they use them, what's the motivation, what else is going on there that provides us context for understanding what's in the plan and moving forward from there. The survey's already been launched. We actually have a pretty good response rate already, which surprised us quite a bit. Fingers crossed we can get about 10 more, and then we might actually have a sample size that makes Carolyn happy. So we'll see how that works. And we're going to be using the survey both to understand placemaking, creative placemaking, but also our work on DEI and also our work on universities and colleges and their role as arts and cultural anchors. The other thing that we have going on, and then we'll get into Q&A because I'm noticing we're at 10:35, is there are, and I'm guessing everybody else in the room is in the same way, there are so many projects that we want to do and not enough hours in the day to be able to do them. And we've had such a good experience with like our interdisciplinary work that we're growing our team as well. And we're adding on Stephanie Ryberg-Webster at Cleveland State, who's a historic preservationist, Jonathan Chrisman at University of Arizona, who's in applied humanities. We're also adding on Deanna Roberto, who's incredible. She's a PhD student at the University of Delaware that does public policy work. We're also creating and solidifying an actual technical working group of practitioners to help guide our research and its relevance. And we're working on this phase 2 piece, but the primary reason that we've added in this new group is that we're currently looking at diversity, equity, inclusion in arts and cultural districts. So continuing to build off our plan work, continuing to build off our DEI things. And so as we get into the Q&A portion about the paper that we have here, if there is time, we're also interested in hearing from all of you about, how your approach to interdisciplinary research and how you balance team dynamics and all of both the good things and the challenging things that come with that kind of collaboration. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda and Carolyn. So please, everyone, feel free to put your questions in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll just point people out. I will just start while we're getting those questions in. So you mentioned you actually addressed something I was wondering, which was authorship of plans and stakeholders, and whether or not that affected sort of the terminology that was used, the integration of creative placemaking within within the broader placemaking practice and conversation. So I just really wanted to mention that. But I guess the second question I have is, I love this, first of all, because you give this really insightful perspective that is so needed within cultural planning on how much of this, in a way, since Markuson and Gadwa's report, it's been this trend, a really sort of hyped up, in a way, trend of creative placemaking and what it can do for communities. And over the years, that trend has died down a little bit in the excitement around it. And now we're at this point about figuring out whether or not this is a planning practice that is not only widespread in its use, but also in its potential outcomes. So I wonder if some of your research, if you're planning on at least, to look at whether or not these plans are actually used and what happens as a result of going through the planning process for these communities. I can think of a lot of examples where the plan itself was the big sort of activity that happened, but after the plan happened, nothing happened as a result. So I'm wondering if that's going to be part of your follow-up research.
I can take that. That is exactly what we're interested in learning from that survey that we have going out right now. We've asked about implementation, specifically about implementation of the plan. We've also asked what activities they're doing that aren't included in the plan, how much of what they're doing is captured in the plan. So we're trying to get at both how is the plan influential, if it is, and then what has been done to implement what, that big process that brought everyone together. Hopefully they did a good public participation process, and are they actually kind of moving that forward, or is it sitting on the shelf? So I think that's exactly the same question that we have.
The other things that your questions remind me of, Joanne, are a couple things. Number one is that the idea of placemaking is not dying down, right? Like, it's just as powerful in planning today as it was 15 years ago or so. And so I'm curious, intellectually, like, what is going on with that idea of creative placemaking? Is it because there's concerns about that, or what has happened with that kind of momentum around it? Or is it taking on a new term, right? Like, is the placekeeping, the inclusive placemaking, all sorts of other things that are happening that are going to start to take over? Like, in the same way, like when I was in a planning program, we were moving from talking about sustainability to resilience, right? Like, and so I'm curious about how the policy conversations will change and how the terms themselves will do that too, and the ways in which the strategies will also be a reflection of that. And I do think it's important to note, like, the plans that we saw them in, where we did see some more differentiation was the City of Minneapolis plan. That's where, and I think Ann Gadwa was part of that plan with, I'm blanking on the other really wonderful person there that helped with that. And a lot of talk in that plan about inclusive placemaking. Roberto Bedoya, was the cultural affairs manager for Oakland when that plan was coming out, who was at the forefront of talking about place keeping and place belonging, and so on too. And so I'm also interested, how do we build better relationships from some of these kind of thought leaders that are both practitioners and and thought leaders that are on these topics, and how do we get them to have more influence in some of these plans? And I think the other thing I would add there, and it's from our earlier work on DEI stuff, is what happens and Carolyn, maybe you can talk a little bit about this, when there's actually like a planning consultant, right, outside of the community who is being hired by a variety of cities to do these kinds of plans. Like, so what does that mean? You know, as opposed to like planning consultants that happen internally that are a part of the community, you know, and how that also is connected to plans that actually do everything in-house, right? And so we see a range of that in our work as well.
Yeah, actually, if I can just speak to the consultant part of that for a second. In other research I've done, not about arts and culture, but I've done other research on planning consultants in general. And we found that to some extent, best practice ideas spread more quickly through consultants, because if they adopt an interesting or good planning idea, then they are able to share it with a lot of different communities. So I think we didn't necessarily see that here. There's a wide variety of consultants that worked on these plans, and we don't necessarily have a window into which consultants were doing what. We were interested in that question, but it turned out to be very complicated because many plans had like 5 different consulting firms working on them. But I would say consultants can actually be a force for more rapidly changing norms around some of this stuff if they're interested in it and buy into it. So, yeah.
And that was like one of the biggest comments we would get from our reviewers on the paper, is they wanted to know, and rightfully so, like who was writing the plans, right? Like what that actually looked like. And I think a lot of people assumed like a negative kind of connotation with the planning consultants, but like as Carolyn noted, it's more complex than that, right? That there are benefits that come with what that also looks like too.
Yeah, agreed. Such an interesting topic too, the consultancy role. Just from my work on cultural facilities, that was constantly coming up. So lots of questions for you. So first, Norman asks if you could give an example of a concrete placemaking project that is different from a creative placemaking project.
So I can think of one, and I will also say, I've had many conversations too, like about really, is there any difference between the terminology, right? Like in terms of, is there anything that's like really different? And then I also think it gets into these conversations about like, what is art and like, what is culture? And so sometimes cities themselves will say, we're having design standards. That's our version of placemaking. So we can determine what kinds of signs are put into an area. And so, I wonder a little bit, like, is that the same thing as creative placemaking, or is that different? And I remember having a conversation with Jason Shupak about this when I was writing a chapter on, I think, arts and cultural districts for the 50th anniversary of the National Endowment for the Arts or something like that. And one of the comments that they made is that creative placemaking, just the very act of that name, puts art and culture in the center of conversations about placemaking, for sure. Now, whether or not that's true, I think that was one of the things that we're interested in finding more about when we're doing the surveys as well. Carolyn, do you want to add anything in there?
No, not on this one.
Okay. Michael's question, so have you seen different definitions for what constitutes arts and culture in the context of creative placemaking? This was a discussion in the stakeholder consultations for DC's planning and grant making process.
Carolyn, do you want that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think we didn't specifically look at that question. In our content analysis, we weren't looking at what the definition of arts and culture was. If we felt like digging back into those, that would be an interesting question to ask. I'm not sure if we have the appetite to go back in again, but I did see, kind of anecdotally, a lot of communities being interested in expanding their definition of arts and culture and being more inclusive. And again, maybe not as many specifics as we would have liked, but I think there's a real interest and willingness to move beyond sort of a kind of a traditional sense of what arts and cultural activities are to a more expanded set. And our work with the universities kind of gets at that a little bit. And we're interested in seeing whether communities in their plans are seeing the university as like a full kind of 360-degree arts workforce development, arts economic development, and then kind of traditional arts and culture, like training artists, having performance venues, that kind of thing. And we are starting to see that, especially in the newer plans. We can definitely see change over time. In some of the older plans, there's less of that, and then some of the newer plans, there's more. And that's actually the subject of another paper that's in the works right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really wonderful question for a variety of reasons. One, like I know I'm personally interested, like why are some plans called art plans and some are called cultural plans, and why are some art and cultural plans, and so on. And it's interesting, you know, how some, like when I participated in the City of Boise cultural plan, and I was part of like an open group, and everyone was on, say what you love about the art, you know, in Boise and the culture in Boise. And like the first 30 minutes just talked about the foothills, right? Like in terms of trying to understand what that looked like. And, you know, and there's like a lot of academic literature that talks about the difference between art and culture too. And like, where does preservation sit? And so one of the biggest critiques that we got like in our earlier work is that the art and cultural plans will often, how do I say this? They won't talk about what's not there anymore, right? Like it's focused on the present. And so, and how does that bridge between art and culture help us think through that?
Michael Rushton.
Okay, wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed this, and thank you so much for joining us. My question is sort of a follow-up to just what you've just been talking about, which is the thing that almost strikes me as missing from the discussion of these creative placemaking plans is actually the art. That they actually seem to say very little about, in fact, what they mean or what they think art specifically does. It's often framed in terms of, you know, community gathering and things like that, but there's all kinds of ways to do that. And so I wondered what you thought about this, that it seemed that there was sort of a donut hole here in these plans when it came to actually thinking about, you know, what, not just what kinds of art, but just what do we think art does? Like, why is this part of the plan at all? I know that's super vague, but.
Okay, yeah. I love that question. Carolyn, do you want, or do you want me to take a stab?
I'll just briefly say that I think a lot of the discussion that I remember seeing was around public art specifically. So, but as you say, a lot of it, you know, in the results, we saw that people were talking about beautification. So the idea that art can beautify a place. But as you say, a lot of it was valued for its ability to bring people together and has this community aspect. So yeah, I think you're right.
I would also just add in there, in general, like I think it's a flaw of some of these plans that don't actually define these terms to begin with. And I think this comes, and again, I'm guessing there's motivations for doing that, right? Like it could be that people don't want to say this is what art is, and then by saying that, you're saying what it isn't, right? So, but there isn't that necessarily that discussion in a lot of them. In the same way, we saw that with the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion. Just it's a very broad kind of swath of that. And the one thing I would say is where you do see it, but not directly championed, are the plans that are connected to things that, like in the appendices, that have like CBI data, right? Because then it actually calls out maybe what some of those occupations are or what some of those industries are, but not necessarily in a very direct kind of way. And, you know, we had talked about going back in there and actually doing the content analysis on like, how are they talking about what is art? How did they define it? Culture, also creativity, and then looking also for the connection to history, right? History and culture itself. And in part, you know, I sometimes wonder a little bit if it's because the way that these departments are siloed, right? And so art may be, if it's coming out of a library department, might have a very different approach as if it's coming out of the historic preservation planning office, right, in terms of the way that we approach those. And so, I mean, this is like why I'm so excited about this kind of work, because like it's endless possibilities of being able to try to understand how people are coming at these ideas. And I guess like I was somewhat surprised by it, just because there's been such an evolution of trying to understand what arts economic development is. But like a lot of these plans focus primarily on tourism, which to me, obviously, but like there has been, like with so many people on this call doing this work, so much more delineation and robustness and thickness that comes with the role of arts and culture in our communities, but not even those very first steps of defining it. And I'll stop talking in just one more second, but we also noticed that too in our DEI work, we wanted to know if the arts and culture plan even knew who was in their communities, right? Like we were looking for very good information on like demographic analysis, and that's not in there either. And so trying to understand like who the arts and cultural plans serve. And again, like, a lot of these cultural people, they're volunteers, right? And so they don't have necessarily that depth of support to be able to do this kind of work too. And they're also trying to make a claim for arts and culture in a climate of where it's often seen as superfluous or on the periphery as well.
Carol Rosenstein.
Hi, thanks so much for a really interesting presentation. I also want to return to some of the same questions. In particular, I want to dig a little bit further into what I think Michael Feldman was referring to in his question that has to do with how some of these issues emerged in the DC Cultural Plan and the related controversies afterwards. In the DC Cultural Plan and other scandals or controversies that took place in the DC City Council, there was a very clear divide between what the canonical larger arts institutions in town, or those that we are like traditional arts, and other sorts of forms of cultural and artistic expression that the mayor was supporting, haircutting, food trucks, other sort of culinary arts. And I guess, first of all, this is the case that just should be looked at in a great deal of detail. I think it is a fascinating and really important case. These questions about what art is called, of course, could not be separated from questions of race and class and ethnicity, and the way politics overlay those questions. So I guess in general, just that is an amazing case and worth looking deeply into. Also because then those larger organizations went to the city council for subsidies, which they secured, and then many other people had them taken off, were activists in taking those line items away from those larger organizations. So this is an ongoing instance of the implementation of a plan that might not look so clearly like the implementation of a plan, but actually is one. But to put this in the frame of your actual presentation, what I'm curious about is whether there is a way, or what ways in which the two of you are thinking of yourselves as promoters of the idea of creative placemaking, given the fact that we know that creative placemaking contributes to gentrification, and that in so many places what it does is simply enable large organizations that have lots of resources already to absorb resources from government that were not available to them before. So how do you position yourselves in a way to be a part of the politics of that, since that's sort of just where you are when you're thinking about the relationship between scholars and practitioners and putting this work forward?
Thanks for that question. And thanks for the information about DC. So that's a good example of something that we couldn't learn from the plan itself, right? So we did look at the DC plan, but there's no hint of that sort of backstory in the plan itself. So thank you for pointing that out, and we certainly will be interested to learn more about that. I mean, I hope if you read the paper, I think we're encouraging practitioners to be more thoughtful and more critical about what placemaking can and cannot do, and what some of its downsides might be. I don't think that placemaking necessarily has to be harmful or discriminatory or even enable gentrification. I think it often does, but I don't think it has to. So I think there are a lot of elements of placemaking, things like putting in some movable furniture. There are some really like low budget, high impact things that, everyone deserves places that are public that they can spend time in and not feel like they have to move around and be kicked out. This is, aside from the sort of arts piece of it, just speaking as sort of a planner, saying that every community and every neighborhood deserves public spaces that feel welcoming and interesting. I also see in the chat, I can only read part of it really quickly, but somebody saying that gentrification isn't always a bad thing. I also want to make sure that we understand the nuance around that too, and acknowledge it, because having higher economic activity in an area, having, I work in Detroit, we have, that's a city that's experienced tremendous abandonment. We're at almost like maybe a third of our peak population. And so when we have economic investment in the city, people do worry about gentrification, but there's a lot of room for economic investment before we get to the point where we have big concerns about it, actually. So I think it depends on the context. So anyway, I think to your point, I think we want to be critical about it. We want to be thoughtful about it. We want practitioners to be critical and thoughtful about it, how they do it. But we also, I don't want to necessarily buy into an idea that placemaking is always problematic. So Amanda.
I do want to add in something here, because I think this is a really good question. So one, I do want to just reiterate, I think, I'm interested in how I was having a conversation with somebody last week here who's does cultural facilities work. And she was talking about how her work used to be a cultural worker. And now she feels like she is a political worker, and what that actually looks like from like an arts and cultural, department and division lens, which I thought was really, interesting for that. I think we are trying to like think more like, to what extent are we just embracing these ideas without actually thinking through what's problematic about them, right? Especially because they're getting a lot of resources, and how are people shifting to deal with some of these problematic issues. The thing I do want to mention that, and again, the DC case sounds amazing, and not amazing, obviously, but like I would like to hear more about that. But we're running into this with this next project that we're taking on, and we're looking at arts and cultural districts across the nation, and we have a database that we're working with. But how do we know? I'm guessing that those overlook a lot of those more organic, community-driven, more emerging arts and cultural districts, and so as an arts academic community and practitioner community, how do we make sure that we do find these places that don't have the same resources, right, that some of these larger arts and cultural facilities do, or common places? And how do we figure out how to put together like an inventory of them, so we can, those are a part of the study, and we just don't assume that it's those kind of larger kind of arts facilities and systems and organizations you're talking about also.
Thank you all. We've run out of time. I wish we could continue, but I really wanted to thank our presenters, Dr. Carolyn Lowe and Dr. Amanda Ashley. Such a stimulating, awesome presentation that so many people, I think, on this call and outside of this community think about a lot, but honestly, I feel like we don't have enough really kind of, I mean, what's the word? We haven't looked into the issues enough, let's just say. So I really appreciate it. And so I would clap if we were all in person. We would clap now. But I hope we can have you back sometime and learn more about your research. And please do let us know how it's going. And again, excellent questions too from everybody. So
thank you for having us. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great. And I hope everybody will join us for our last workshop in 2 weeks. Susan Oman, I believe it's May, I'm not going to say it. It's either May 4th or 6th. Is it 6th, Julia? 4th, May 4th. And so she's our last workshop for the academic year. But we will be sending out a notice about a possible option to do a summer workshop series that'll be much more hands-on, workshopping any works in progress that you might have. So please do keep an eye out for that. And if you're interested, I'll just be running that on my own. So thank you again, everybody. And I hope everyone has a great day. Okay.
Thank you all.
Bye. Feel better, Amanda.
Yes.
Yeah.